All right, so I wanted this to be sexy, I really did. I also wanted to be funny. I do stand up in another life on other nights, but I'm a truth teller, I have to tell the truth, and this tendency of mine started a long time ago. I'm gonna take this off. All right, so I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian cult. I always get some reactions from that. People are like, cult, is she exaggerating? I'm like, no, I'm really not. So the DSM, which most of you are probably familiar with, has criteria for cults. I won't bore you with all of the criteria, but the church that I grew up in fit quite a few of them. So for example, there were very, very rigid rules you had to follow. Everyone had to homeschool their children. Women had to wear long dresses in very basic colors. People had to use a certain curriculum when they were homeschooling their children. A lot of the marriages were arranged. I could go on and on, you guys get the point. As part of this upbringing, I knew very early on I didn't really fit in. I had a lot of questions. So for example, at age 5, I asked my parents, my dad specifically, who was an officer in the church, I'm like, so why can't women lead prayer in the church? And the answer was Eve. So immediately after that, probably about a year later, my sister and I, we grew up in LA, we saw a sign, a billboard where we were driving. My parents had these little visors on the windows that are supposed to prevent sun from coming in and heating up the car. In our case, they were to prevent us from seeing the outside world. But somehow we snuck a peek, we saw a billboard and it said sex shop. And we're like, all right, so what's sex? My parents conferred really quickly. My mom turns around, she said, well, sex is when a man and a woman, obviously, come together under the watchful eye of God. I won't bore you with how kinky that description sounds, but to this day I'm like, what? Like if your goal was to deter us, it didn't work. And much later, let's say like 8, I started to really question the structure of the church services themselves. So the parents, all the adults would be downstairs. They would send up the kids to Sunday school, which isn't unique. Obviously, a lot of religious institutions have that, but in our case, we were up there for hours and hours. And at this point, not only was I a questioner, but I was also like, you know what? Like, these kids are suffering. Like, I need to like rise to the occasion and be a leader. So there were 3 and 4 and 5-year-old kids that were crying. So I'm like, let me come up with a game. And I'm like, let's pretend like we're camping. So we would like take these little blocks and like these cardboard boxes and try to like build what essentially looked like a tent city looking back on it. But we would try to build some sort of game. And there was a boy, so I was about 8 at the time, he was about 11. His name was Burgess. And we were kind of in a little tent area. And he said, Christine, have you ever looked what's underneath your pants? And I'm like, not really, like the bathroom maybe. And he's like, well, let's look at it. So very rudimentary version of playing doctor, but he pulled down his fly and pulled out his penis. And I was like, okay. And he's like, do you want to pull out yours? So I kind of started to unzip my pants, all very innocent though. Bear in mind, we have no education, we have no knowledge. We're doing this because we're bored, we're scared, we have no idea what the fuck is going on. So he does this. Right then, a Sunday school teacher comes up and says, what are you kids doing? And we got extremely scared. And she looked and she said, you, points at him. She says, get up. And I'm like screaming at the top of my lungs. I'm like, it's my fault. It was my idea. And she's like, no, it wasn't. She grabs him by the hand, by the wrist, takes him downstairs. 2 hours later, all of the children above a certain age, let's say 6, and a bunch of the parents were pulled into an auditorium. Sat down in seats just like this. And in that auditorium, this kid was publicly spanked in front of 100 people. 100 people, including me. And I tried to do the same thing. I looked at him, I saw that he was scared, I stood up, started to scream, it's my fault, it was my idea. I pushed him to do it. My dad literally grabbed me by the wrist, same thing, put me down. And he had to turn around and say, "I'm sorry," to me, to my parents, to the crowd. And I'll never, ever, ever forget the look on his face that like his entire innocence had been ruined in one moment. And I know it's uncomfortable, but this is the truth. This is the truth, and this is exactly what happened. I then spent many, many years in a way trying to make up for this. I had heard this narrative my entire life that a woman was responsible, one woman was responsible for death, suffering, illness, sin. And then in this case, it was actually someone else's idea, but he was innocent too. And I was the one who tried to shoulder the blame. It didn't work. Many, many, many years later, I went back to Los Angeles for my 15-year high school reunion. And I just left a club, I was completely hammered. I was like wandering down Hollywood Boulevard trying to find a cigarette. And I'm like wandering down, and I go down these escalators, and I see this guy, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm like running, like almost tripping all over myself. Completely not the girl that you would ever recognize growing up in a cult, or maybe you would. And I look, and I see this face that I recognize, and I see him. I see Burgess down the stairs, and we do this like, comedy of errors thing where he goes up, I go down. We're trying to like reach each other across the like escalator stairs, and we finally make it down. He has a cigarette, thank God, and we sit and we smoke together, and I start bawling, and I'm like, I am so fucking sorry. He went to jail, he got into drugs, he got sent to a correctional facility in Mexico to set him straight. And we sat there, and he said, Christine, it is not your fault. It's not my fault. It's their fault. And that was a very, very, very crucial moment for me. This was about 2 years ago, to finally heal. But my forbidden fruit, again, I want to be sexy. It's not. And no one's at fault when you're that young and you don't have the ability to make your own choices. That's all I've got. Thank you.